Hello everyone, and welcome to DM Tools with MaxMcCool. On today's episode of Monsters Manifested, we're going to be covering the Chasme. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. The Chasme stat block can be found on page 57 of the Monster Manual, and its lore can be found on page 53, amongst all of the other lesser demons. The lore for the Chasme goes as follows. This loathsome demon resembles an unspeakable crossing of humanoid and fly. A Chasme shuffles about on 4 spindly legs that can find purchase on walls and ceilings. A droning sound precedes the approach of a Chasme, inflicting foes with a terrible lethargy that leaves them open to attack. The lowly Chasmes serve more powerful masters as interrogators or taskmasters. A Chasme lives to dole out torturer's punishment and has a knack for spotting demons that have deserted their lords. Capturing and returning such traitors allows a Chasme to torment the victim without fear of reprisal. And that's all there is when it comes to the lore of the Chasme, but as I mentioned before, that seems to be a going trend with the lesser demons in the Monster Manual, and as troublesome as it may seem, I do feel that it allows us or grants us a form of sort of creative freedom that we can use when developing adventures using the Chasme, and any of these lesser demons really. But before we get into all of that, let's move on to the stat block, shall we? So, as I mentioned before, the Chasme stat block can be found on page 57 of the Monster Manual, and its information goes as follows. The Chasme is a large fiend, demon, with a chaotic evil alignment. It has an armor class of 15, which is natural armor, has hit points that average 84 or 13d10 plus 13, and it has a movement speed of 20 feet as well as a flying speed of 60 feet. The Chasme has a strength of 15, a dexterity of 15, a constitution of 12, an intelligence of 11, a wisdom of 14, and a charisma of 10. Its saving throws include dexterity plus 5 and wisdom plus 5. It has the skill of perception at plus 5. It has damage resistances to cold, fire, and lightning. It has damage immunity to poison, and of course is immune to the poisoned condition. The Chasme has senses of blind sight for 10 feet, dark vision for 120 feet, and a passive perception of 15. The languages it can speak are Abyssal and Telepathy for 120 feet. The Chasme is a challenge rating of 6. Onto the abilities. Drone. The Chasme produces a horrid droning sound to which demons are immune. Any other creature that starts its turn within 30 feet of the Chasme must succeed on a DC 12 Constitution saving throw or fall unconscious for 10 minutes. A creature that can't hear the drone automatically succeeds on the save. The effect on the creature ends if it takes damage or if another creature takes an action to splash it with holy water. If a creature's saving throw is successful or the effect ends for it, it is immune to the drone for the next 24 hours. Magic resistance. The Chasme has advantage on saving throws against spells and other magical effects. And finally, spider climb. The Chasme can climb difficult surfaces, including upside down on ceilings without needing to make an ability check. That's all for the abilities. Now on to the actions. Proboscis is a melee weapon attack with a plus 5 to hit, a reach of 5 feet on one target. On a hit, it does an average of 16 or 4d6 plus 2 piercing damage plus an average of 24 or 7d6 necrotic damage, and the target's hit point maximum is reduced by an amount equal to the necrotic damage taken. If this effect reduces a creature's hit point maximum to 0, the creature dies. This reduction to a creature's hit point maximum lasts until the creature finishes a long rest or until it is affected by a spell like Greater Restoration. And that's it. That's all there is when it comes to the Chasme in terms of stats and abilities. A fairly straightforward monster, and I think that there's a couple of different ways that we can go in terms of implementing a Chasme that would be effective or fun for the players at our table. So without further ado, let's move on to some adventure crafting. So immediately the first thing that came to my mind, reading about the Chasme's lore and information, was, well, really two things. First was using a Chasme as a form of interrogator, as it were, in order to extract information from lowly individuals or suspects of some form. And the other way that I had imagined a Chasme would be as some sort of strange, demonic sort of Frankenstein's monster, this strange crossbreeding of magic and perhaps a mad wizard or mage or something of that nature who has made a deal perhaps with a demon lord of some sort in order to create an army of monsters or super creatures that could assist them in taking over the lands or something like that. And the offer that's presented to the individual, this sort of mad scientist or mad mage, if you would, is that of the Chasme. So I'll do my best to create an adventure or a scenario using each of those. You could even use them together, in which there's a mad mage that is running rampant across the lands and is taking over towns and cities and kingdoms with this strange, monstrous army of half humanoid, half insectoid monsters that seem to be unkillable and drain all of the people of their energy or their will to fight as they drone on while they fly above the rooftops of these cities and sort of render everyone useless and sort of come in and just clean up the mess and the mage takes over. But you could also use them individually. So for the interrogation style of adventure, using a Chasme, so you could do something to the effect of, like, perhaps your players are traveling across a road or between towns and cities, sort of across an open field, anything to that effect, and they stumble upon something that catches their attention that would pull them away from the main road. Perhaps it's an abandoned encampment. Perhaps it's a small destroyed kind of ancient chapel or ruined structure of some sort. Perhaps it's a destroyed cart and a couple of horse corpses on the road, which they might want to stop and investigate. And they could get ambushed or kidnapped by some ne'er-do-wells, let's call it. And perhaps the ne'er-do-wells take them back to their base of operations or hidden location, what have you. And in an attempt to extract information or some form of resources from the players, the villainous individuals use a Chasme, sort of lock them in a room with a Chasme up on the ceiling, and it's darkened and they can't really see it. So the Chasme just drones, and the droning causes the adventurers to lose sight, lose focus, lose their resolve, and they become susceptible to interrogation. Or you could even do something to the effect of having the Chasme appear as they are ambushed by said ne'er-do-wells, and it just flies up in the air and drones at the party, and the ones that fail their Constitution saving throw immediately fall unconscious. And though that may only take place for 10 minutes, perhaps the ne'er-do-wells are not too far away, and they've managed to abscond with the party. And in that instance, you'd have a pretty solid scenario or encounter set up and established that leads to another one where the players now have to enact an escape plan. Maybe they've lost all of their gear and it's in a chest somewhere and they have to recover it. Maybe they have their gear, just not their weapons, so they have to sort of use some makeshift items or some improvised weapons in order to knock the enemies unconscious and escape or kill them outright. And maybe they have to take the Chasme on at the end in order to escape, or maybe they don't. Perhaps there's more to it. Perhaps there's a dedicated party of brigands or bandits or what have you that basically just go out on patrols and look at these spots that they've established for intercepting and abducting or kidnapping unsuspecting individuals, right? They might have established a bunch of ambush zones within a certain radius, perhaps a 10-minute radius of their campsite, and they just sort of patrol around. And then that could lead the players to want to have sort of a revenge mission and take on that band and defeat the Chasme, it may make them want to destroy this practice altogether. You could use the bandits and the Chasme combo perhaps as slavers, and that's what they're doing, right? They bring out Chasme with them to these ambush zones and knock people unconscious with the droning of the Chasme, and they cuff them up and put them in cages and they sell them to whomever, right? And you could definitely build upon your world in that regard and sort of have your players interact with the bottom rung of a much higher order of operations that is much worse than just some bandits with a lesser demon in their employ harassing and robbing unsuspecting passerbys, right? Now, as a Frankenstein's monster, you could definitely implement the Chasme as sort of an experiment gone wrong, right? Perhaps this mad tinkerer, scientist, what have you, is not necessarily evil. Perhaps they've gone and done things that have been very beneficial to wherever it is they're from or the region that they live in. You know, perhaps you could establish a mage or a wizard of some sort that works very well in arcane genetics, let's call it, and has developed impressively strong and fortuitous oxen that never seem to tire and manage to till the fields of the lands without ever needing rest or needing very short amounts of rest. Or perhaps they've developed horses, steeds that don't seem to tire or don't need to be fed as often as others, as your standard horse does, anything like that, you know. And perhaps this mage was assigned or contracted to create a creature that could incapacitate and subdue the enemies of the town. Perhaps there's a warring faction that's trying to take over the town. Perhaps there's a mad tyrannical lord or emperor or anything like that that's pushing the envelope a little bit too much and sort of overstepping their bounds in terms of borders. Or, you know, perhaps there was an attempted invasion on the keep and the ruling individual or perhaps the head of the guard assigned this mage or scientist of sorts to develop a creature that could protect them without even, let's say, necessarily killing the opponents, right? Just sort of subduing them, and so they could be whisked away and sort of dumped outside the castle walls, as it were. But the wizard is not familiar with creating something aggressive like that. They've only ever worked on, you know, improving livestock or pack animals or things like that. And so the first attempt is the creation of this strange humanoid insectoid aberration. And perhaps this wizard or mage, what have you, loses control of the creature. And now the creature is running amok throughout the town, right? It broke out of its confinement. It knocked out the mage with this droning attack that it does. And it managed to escape and is now running rampant all over the place. You could even make that something that had happened a long time ago and make it part of your history. And now there's just a region of land or environment or terrain that is no longer inhabited by anybody, right? Perhaps your players are traveling along a road and they come into this like abandoned ghost town and they have no idea what's going on, but it seems pretty quiet. It seems pretty empty. There's no humans about. You could even make it very odd and strange, you know, sort of like plates on tables with rotted food on them as though everybody sort of left in a hurry. And as the players sort of investigate the town, or maybe if they decide to rest in this empty town, they hear this strange droning noise coming out from the darkness through the air, you know. And who knows, perhaps the mage made one and your players have to take on one. If you had higher level players, perhaps the mage made a number of them. Maybe they made 3 of them, 4 of them, half a dozen of them. Who knows? And your players have to take on these creatures as sort of a boogeyman monster in the night type of scenario. I think that could work pretty well. I think that could be quite interesting. And I think you could even create something that was sort of strange and odd for your players, that they aren't necessarily too sure about what's happening or what's going on. And this town seems sort of strange, you know, because it's empty. No bones, no skeletons, no corpses necessarily, just empty. They can find a barracks with stocks of arms and armor that have long since rusted away. They could have even individuals from the previous town or city or wherever they came from, previous encampment, tell them, don't go this way, don't take the route this far, don't travel through this area past sundown because people go in and they don't come back, and you could even then have the players investigate the surrounding area if you wanted to give the Chasme a lair in which it resides type thing. And you could present them with, a sort of more and more corpses and eviscerated individuals and animals and stuff like that to let them know that they're sort of getting hotter, catching on to the scent. But I think it could turn out to be a pretty interesting result. And this could also work well if you were going for something a bit more suspenseful, tense, horrific in nature, rather than your standard high fantasy. But either way, I think it could be fun. Finally, you could always use the Chasme as the monster of the week if you wanted to, and have your players traveling through a dungeon. They kick down the doors, and they're taking on all sorts of baddies and monstrous creatures and stuff of that nature. And as they are progressing through this dungeon, they hear this strange droning noise that sort of gets louder or quieter as they travel through certain chambers or hallways. Or perhaps they don't hear it until they get to a certain point. Perhaps there's a certain encounter with another creature beforehand in another chamber or something like that. And the sound of combat, the noise has awoken the dretch further down in the depths of the dungeon, right? Perhaps your players encounter a number of dretches, which are smaller demonic monsters at a much lower challenge rating, which we'll get into next episode. But perhaps they have to take on a number of them, right? Maybe a dozen of them or 20 of them. And they're there hacking and slashing and trying to take on all of these dretches. And just the noise from the combat that took place was enough to awaken the Chasme. And perhaps now the Chasme is patrolling the dungeon. Perhaps it's tailing the adventurers. Perhaps it's trailing them, right? If the Chasme can climb on walls and prefers sort of dank, dark corners and hidden spots, you could have a Chasme crawling on the ceiling, following the players the whole way through. And if they look up, they can't quite spot it, unless they have dark vision, which they almost assuredly will. But you could implement things like that, right? Sort of darkened rooms. Perhaps the dungeon has a magical darkness, right? Has an aura of magical darkness that dark vision cannot pierce through. And because of that, what has ended up happening is the players have to sort of go in blind or just with the 20-foot radius of torchlight that they may have and sort of traverse through this dungeon in order to acquire the treasure or get to the end and stop the monster that is razing the village and causing havoc for all the common folk, right? And I think that could turn out to be a very solid dungeon crawl if that was the route you wanted to go and just sort of give your players a side quest or a small mission, or if you're running a more lax game that's kind of Monster Hunter style or Monster of the Week style. I think that's a totally valid way of going about running an adventure while implementing a Chasme as the final monster. But all in all, the Chasme is an interesting creature, a very interesting demon, looks different, which I find very cool. And I think that there's a lot of different things that you can do with it in terms of creating an adventure around it or a combat encounter or a scenario. Using it, that would be interesting and different for your players. And especially since the Chasme stat block is relatively simple and straightforward, but effective in what it does. Like, the Chasme doesn't do very much. It has one action and one ability outside of its resistances and ability to climb, which is the drone, and then the action of its proboscis, which is highly destructive when you consider the fact that the necrotic damage applied to anyone that it hits is the amount in which their maximum hit points are reduced. You could cause some serious trouble with a Chasme, throwing especially a number of them at an underleveled party or even at a party of level 6. It could definitely be troublesome, especially if the players don't roll the greatest and the Chasme rolls really well. you could have a nice tough fight on your hands that I think is unique, especially if you implement the fact that it can climb on difficult surfaces, climb on ceilings, doesn't have to make an ability check to be successful in doing so. It can fly. It has this drone that'll knock individuals unconscious, and then the players have to deliberate and decide on, well, what do we do? Do we try to bring back our teammate? Do we try to wake them up? And there's only really two ways to wake them up based on the stat block, which is by them taking damage or getting splashed with holy water, which is an interesting aspect. That regular water won't work, but holy water would. I mean, I understand thematically the reasoning for it, because it's a demon, so holy water would bless the individual or cure them of whatever demonic possession it has over them. But I do find it quite interesting, and that can cause even further trouble, actually, because then your players have to attack their teammate, which if they use melee, that'll be an auto crit, would cause some more damage. And then if that individual gets back up, but then gets hit by the Chasme, they take much more damage, plus the reduction to their maximum hit points from the necrotic damage. Yeah, you could cause a lot of destruction using a Chasme. But again, all in all, pretty cool monster, pretty cool demon, unique and very different. I like it quite a bit. But that's all I got for you fine folks today when it comes to using the Chasme as a creature for your adventure. I'd like to thank you all very much for tuning in. I hope you all had a great Christmas, happy holidays, wonderful New Year's, all of that stuff. And I look forward to our next episode, which, as I previously mentioned, will be the Dretch, a lower level monster, but I think that there's a couple of different things that we could do with it, and I think that we can make something interesting, especially for low level play, which can be pretty dangerous, so I think that it'll be a good one. But anyway, thank you all once again for tuning in. I highly appreciate it. Please feel free to rate the podcast, leave a review where you can, if you can, when you can, and all of that fun stuff, as it would really help me out. If you're listening to this episode of Monsters Manifested on YouTube, I'd appreciate it if you could like, comment, subscribe, all that fun stuff, as it would help me out, help the channel grow, help the podcast grow, and again, get this podcast out to more people, more ears that might need some help or some creative inspiration when developing their adventures and scenarios and stuff like that for the people at their table. And yeah, that's about it. So until next time, have a good day, everyone.